A very good afternoon to one and all. On behalf of the National Resource Center for Value Education and Engineering, IIT Delhi, I, Ms. Dimple Patel, welcome you all to this event. It is a great honor to have with us Swami Medhananda ji, a renowned monk and senior research fellow at the Vedanta Society of Southern California, who would share his insights on the topic Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, signifying the cross-cultural philosophy of religion. Now I request Swamiji to please come on stage. And I request Professor Rahul Garg to kindly welcome and introduce Swami Medhananda ji.
Privileged to have Swami Medhananda ji here among us today. He comes from very distant. He is a monk of the Ramakrishna Order and currently serving as a senior research fellow in philosophy at the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood. He is also the Hindu Chaplain at both UCLA and the University of California. He is the section editor. He is the section editor for Springer's International Journal of Hindu Studies, overseeing submissions in Hindu and cross-cultural philosophy of religion. His current research focuses on global philosophy of religion, cosmopsychism, the epistemology of mystical experiences, Indian scriptural hermeneutics, and Vedāntic philosophical traditions, especially the philosophies of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo. Swamiji has earned his Ph.D. in 2009 from the University of California at Berkeley, specializing in German aesthetics. He then joined Ramakrishna Order in 2010 at the Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Educational and Research Institute in the Belur Math, West Bengal, where he served as associate professor and head of the program in philosophy until 2021. He received initiation into Sannyasa in the year 2020. He is author of 3 books: Swami Vivekananda's Vedāntic Cosmopolitanism, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, and the Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency, Revaluating German Aesthetics from Kant to Adorno. He has published over 30 articles in reputed journals and has delivered lectures in globally renowned universities, including Harvard, Princeton, and Oxford. We are indeed privileged to have him with us today. And, such a person who also has, a unique exposure to both the mystical side and the experience side of the philosophy, as well as the scholarly side, is indeed quite rare, and it's a privilege to have him here, and we're delighted to invite him to speak on this topic. Thank you.
I would request sir to please felicitate Swamiji with a bouquet. Thank you, sir. A key sacred ritual to initiate important events is the lighting of a lamp, which signifies the triumph of knowledge over ignorance by dispelling darkness, and the invocation of divine blessings. So I request Swami Medhananda ji and the esteemed dignitaries and professors to kindly light the lamp, while an invocation prayer is recited by my colleague Vicky Kachera.
ॐ वक्रतुण्ड महाकाय सूर्यकोटिसमप्रभा निर्विघ्नं कुरु मे देव सर्वकार्येषु सर्वदा ईश्वरो गुरुरात्मेति मूर्तिभेदविभागिने व्योमवद्व्याप्तदेहाय दक्षिणामूर्तये नमः यं नित्यमानन्दमनन्तमेकं शिवेति नाम्ना श्रुतयो गृह्णन्ति तस्यावतारो नररूपधारी कृपासुदाब्धेर्भुवि रामकृष्णः जननीं शारदां देवीं रामकृष्णं जगद्गुरुं पादपद्मे तयोः श्रित्वा प्रणमामि मुहुर्मुहुः ॐ नमः श्रीयतिराजाय विवेकानन्दसूरये सच्चित्सुखस्वरूपाय स्वामिने तापहारिणे स्वामिने तापहारिणे
Thank you all. Now, without further ado, I would request Swamiji to commence with the talk.
So do I need to use this mic or can I just speak in this? I don't need to hold the mic, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, this is on. And this next, and this one is the point.
Yes. Om asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritam gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at IIT Delhi. This is the tail end of a 1-month visit to India. I've been to many, many places. Started in Delhi and then Ahmedabad, Chennai, Pondicherry, Belur Math, Uttarkashi, Rishikesh, Gangotri, many places. So it's a delight to be back in Delhi, and I'm flying back to Hollywood in the middle of the night today at 2 in the morning. So it's an honor that I'm able to come here and speak to you today. Thank you all for coming. There's, in my opinion, nothing more sublime than spirituality and religion. And at the same time, there's a kind of tragic irony in the fact that more blood has been shed in the name of religion than for any other cause. And this is a fact that we see on a daily basis. If you just open a newspaper, look at the news, and it's troubling and it's disturbing And it's not that it's a new thing. Religious fanaticism and violence has been happening for millennia. So the important question is, how do we preserve what's so powerful and what's so valuable and sublime about spirituality and religion, while jettisoning all those negative things that have come to be associated with religion and spirituality, unfortunately. And to that end, I'll be giving this talk today called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. The focus of the talk will be the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. Many of you are familiar with him to some extent. Born in 1836 and died in 1886. He was many things, and you can call him different things. You can call him a yogi, a mystic, an avatara, whatever you want. One of the things that he's most famous for is having taught the harmony of all religions. In fact, if you go to Bengal and you ask somebody about Ramakrishna, they might say, yes, he taught Jotomot Totopot. That's a Bengali teaching of his, as many fades, so many paths. And so he's known as the teacher of the harmony of all religions. At the same time, I don't think most people have thought deeply enough about precisely how all the different world's spiritual and religious traditions can really be harmonious. How can they all be valid paths at the same time? And I think that we need to think more rigorously about this. And that's what I'm going to sort of try to encourage us to do together in this talk. And if you want more details and more kind of depth, you can look at my book with the same title, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. I'll mention it at the end of the presentation as well. Okay, so regarding his life, very briefly, it's striking that he practiced many different spiritual disciplines in a number of different religious traditions. Within Hinduism, he practiced Vaishnavism, Tantra, Advaita Vedanta, and other disciplines as well. Even outside of Hinduism, he also practiced Christianity, and he also practiced Islam. And it's almost unprecedented. I mean, I'm not aware of too many other saints in any country who have practiced this many different spiritual disciplines and different religious traditions. So that's one of his most unusual and unique features. And more strikingly, because he was a mystic and he was so earnest in his pursuit of the divine, through all of these different spiritual disciplines, he realized the same divine truth in different forms and aspects. And it was on the basis of his different sadhanas, his different spiritual practices, and on the basis of his many different kinds of spiritual experiences, both theistic and non-theistic. So he realized the divine as non-dual pure consciousness. I think Swami Sarvapriyanji spoke here last year. I'm sure that he spoke on pure consciousness from the standpoint of Advaita Vedanta. So Sri Ramakrishna certainly practiced Advaita Vedanta under Totapuri, the monk Totapuri. But he also had many different theistic spiritual experiences, which means he experienced the personal God in many different forms, many different aspects. He realized God as Kali, as Mother Kali, as Hanuman, as Rama, as Krishna, and so on. As Ram Lala also, the child form of Rama. And it was on the basis of all of these different extraordinarily diverse spiritual experiences that he taught as many fades, so many paths. Mot pot, Jotomot Totopot. Another one is Anantamot Anantapot, which means infinite are the doctrines, and each of those infinite doctrines are paths to the same goal. But as I said, I think we need to think more deeply about how exactly he harmonized the world religions. And I think that there are two common misconceptions about his teachings on the doctrine of the harmony of all religions. The first misconception is that he held that all religions are true. This is a common way that people understand the harmony of religions. All religions are true. And then they can proceed to debunk that and say that that's stupid. Because they're not all true. They can't all be true because they make conflicting claims. So if one religion is right, then the others must be wrong. That's the logic. So Frank Morales is an example of somebody who I think misinterprets Ramakrishna's teachings to hold that all religions are true. Okay, and The second misconception is that Ramakrishna harmonized the world religions on the basis of classical Advaita Vedanta, Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta, according to which the common goal of all religious paths is the realization of non-dual pure consciousness. This is also very common. Some of the monks of our order, like Dhireshānanda, that's the person I mentioned here, but there are many other examples that we could point to. What they claim is that Sri Ramakrishna taught the harmony of religions on the basis of classical Advaita Vedanta, and we'll see in a few slides from now in a little bit more detail what classical Advaita Vedanta actually holds. But the basic idea is that the common goal of all religious paths is the realization of your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. Okay. But what's wrong with these two different views? First, regarding that first view, that all religions are true, Ramakrishna actually never said that. He never held that all religions are true. What he claimed is that all the different religions are different paths to the same goal, to the same divine truth. But not that all the religions are all true in any kind of crude way. And contrary to the second misconception, that he harmonized the world religions on the basis of classical Advaita Vedanta, he never held that devotees of the personal God, so theistic religious practitioners who believe in the personal God, it could be Christians who believe in God as Christ or God the Father. It could be Muslims who believe in God as Allah. It could be Vaishnavas who believe in God as Krishna, and so on and so forth. He never held that these bhaktas, these devotees of the personal God, have to attain Advaitic realization of non-dual pure consciousness. This Advaitic non-dual realization of pure consciousness is not mandatory for everyone. Okay, and if he harmonized all the world religions on the basis of this Advaitic state of non-dual pure consciousness, then it would have to be mandatory, right? But he explicitly denies that. Okay, in fact, there's one place where, in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, many of you are probably familiar with the text, a follower of classical Advaita Vedanta named Mohima Chakraborty, he asked Sri Ramakrishna a question. He said, in Bengali, Bhaktaroto nirvan chai na, which means even bhaktas, devotees of the personal God, even they need to attain nirvana at the end of the day. Nirvana, not in the Buddhistic sense, but in the sense of merging your individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. Okay? And his answer was emphatic. He said, no, it's not like that. There are some devotional paths, some devotional philosophies in which there is Nitya Krishna and Nitya Bhakta. There is the eternal Krishna, and there are his eternal devotees. And then he says, Chinmoy Sham Chinmoy Dham, which means Krishna is consciousness embodied. And Chinmoy Dhamma, his abode, his divine abode, is equally consciousness embodied. And so what Ramakrishna says is, for devotees of the personal God who want to remain in loving communion with their beloved God, whether that's Krishna or Allah or whoever, they can reside in an eternal heaven as an eternal soul dwelling with God. So there's still a duality in the sense that you're separate from God. In order to enjoy the bliss of communing with God, you have to be slightly separate from God. So that's not an Advaitic state of realization. And yet, Ramakrishna says, that is the ultimate goal for them. Is the mic still working? Or yeah, it's fine, okay. So for them, for bhaktas, the ultimate state is not the realization of non-dual pure consciousness, but dwelling in an eternal heaven. We'll get to that in more detail later. So, I think these are two misinterpretations of Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions. Now I'm going to, for the rest of the presentation, defend what I think is a more plausible and compelling interpretation of his teachings. To help us, I want to bring in a paradigm introduced by the American Christian theologian Alan Race. He wrote a book published in 1983 where he introduced this threefold typology of trying to understand how the different world religions relate to each other. Okay, and these three terms have become so popular now. Scholars use them all the time in theology and philosophy of religion, so it's very important that you familiarize yourselves with these technical terms, what these concepts mean. One problem, however, is that different scholars define these terms in slightly different ways. And so there isn't one common definition of these terms. I'm going to now stipulate definitions of these three terms for the purpose of this presentation. So, exclusivism. This is the view that only one religion leads to the highest fulfillment. So whether you call that moksha or salvation, while all other religions fail to afford any kind of fulfillment and may even lead to eternal damnation, to an eternal hell. So an example of a Christian theologian, a Protestant Christian theologian, his name is Karl Barth, a German theologian, so he held this view. My religion alone is true and valid and efficacious. Other religions are hopeless. They won't get you anywhere, and they may even lead you to eternal hell. So it's not a very pleasant doctrine. This is, I hope you can already tell, exclusivism is at the philosophical root of all forms of religious sectarianism, religious bigotry, religious violence, okay? Religious chauvinism. But there's two more paradigms for understanding the relationship among the different world religions. The second paradigm is what's called inclusivism. Now, again, remember, these are terms defined in a technical way. Because in a popular way, the term inclusivism has very positive connotations. Being inclusive is a very good thing. In fact, you know, now there's a big term in the US called DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Inclusion, so, that must be a good thing. No, they mean it in a very specific sense here in this context, in theology and philosophy of religion. This is how it's defined. Inclusivism is the view that only one religion leads directly to the highest fulfillment, but other religions lead indirectly to the highest fulfillment or afford lesser forms of fulfillment. So there's always a hierarchical structure of higher and lower involved in any kind of inclusivist paradigm, okay? An example on the Christian side is a Catholic theologian named Karl Rahner, R-A-H-N-E-R. He is well known for having come up with this concept of anonymous Christians. So his idea is that even non-Christians, by the grace of Christ, can eventually attain salvation because they're Christians without knowing that they're Christians. So that's what he calls anonymous Christians. So I can be a Hindu and I can be a Vaishnava, let's say, worshiping Krishna. And yet I can attain Christian heaven in the end. How? Through the grace of Christ, by being an anonymous Christian. That's the idea. So I hope you can tell how this is kind of inclusivistic in structure, how there's still a hierarchy, because Rana also will say at the end of the day, it's still better not to be anonymously Christian, but to be a full-blown card-carrying Catholic, especially, ideally. So there's always a higher and lower there. Catholicism is the best. Other religions aren't completely hopeless, but it'll be a more indirect route. It'll be a more arduous, more difficult, more treacherous route to the same goal. So why not be a Christian? That's the idea, or why, specifically Catholic. Okay, now, this is, I think, less well known, but I think it's probably more important, especially since I'm speaking in India here at IIT Delhi. On the Indian side, can you think of an Indian spiritual tradition which is inclusivistic in structure? Of course, there are many which are exclusivistic. Madhva, for instance. Some of you might be familiar with Madhva's school. It's commonly called Dvaita Vedanta, the dualistic school of Vedanta. I don't think followers of that path actually appreciate that term. And so they call themselves Madhva Vedantins, which means followers of Madhva. So we can use that term, Madhva Vedanta. So Madhva Vedanta believes in an eternal hell. I think there's a common misconception about Hinduism that all Hindus, they believe in universal liberation, everybody will be liberated in the end, but that's not actually true. Because Madhva Vedanta is a strand within Hinduism, and they believe in an eternal hell. And they believe that some souls, there's a category of soul which they call tamo yogya, a colorful term which means those souls who are destined for the darkness of eternal hell. So this sounds like Christian predestination kind of stuff here. So there's an equivalent in Hinduism, that's Madhva Vedanta. And so there are some souls who will not get liberation. They will in fact be doomed to dwelling in this eternal hell. Okay, so that falls under exclusivism. But on the Indian side, I would suggest that classical Advaita Vedanta is a form of inclusivism, okay? And I'm going to make a case for that in the subsequent slides, so stay tuned. Now, the third paradigm is what's called religious pluralism, okay? And again, this term is bandied about all the time, and in popular parlance, it means something very different. I mean it in a very technical sense here. Multiple religions are equally capable of leading to the highest fulfillment, okay? Multiple. Notice I don't say all. Okay? Because if you say all, I think the position becomes pretty implausible. Because I can just invent a religion right now, and I can say, you know, by boiling spaghetti, you can realize God. That's my religion. Let's call it the Spaghetti Vedanta. So is that an equally valid path? Will that take me to liberation? No, probably not. You could do that. You can, if you cook spaghetti as a karma yoga, then that could take you to God. So that's a kind of caveat. But anyway, sorry. The point is, though, multiple religions is more plausible than all religions. Why? Because I think Ramakrishna is plausibly claiming that all the major world religions that he was aware of, so we're talking about Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta within Hinduism, and probably some other religions, they are equally capable of taking us to the highest goal of liberation, okay? But that doesn't mean that all quote-unquote religions across the board, and just think about terroristic religions, right? There are some religions which believe in committing violence, right? Surely that's not going to take you to the highest goal. Okay, so he has to actually exclude some self-styled religions from this harmony, okay? Any religion, any so-called religion that prescribes unethical practices, for instance, I think by definition that gets disqualified as religion in the relevant sense, okay? Now, who are some religious pluralists? On the Christian side, there are some figures, and I'm not going to go in detail about who they are and what their views are, but John Hick and Paul Knitter. These are both Christian religious pluralists, okay? And on the Indian side, I would suggest that Sri Ramakrishna is a good example of a religious pluralist, as opposed to an inclusivist or an exclusivist, okay? And for the rest of the presentation, I'll be explaining in what sense I take him to be a religious pluralist and why that matters for us today. First of all, as promised, let me explain briefly why I think that Shankara's school of classical Advaita Vedanta is a form of inclusivism. Okay, so what does Advaita Vedanta hold? The famous Sanskrit formula is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmevana Paraha. Brahman alone is real, and here Brahman means non-dual, impersonal, pure consciousness. Okay, the world is unreal, Jagat Mithya. It's an illusory appearance. The individual, the jiva, is none other than Brahman. So, 5 main doctrines that we can pull out of this formula. Number 1, the sole reality is Brahman, which is defined as non-dual, attributeless, pure consciousness. Nirguna Brahman, Nirvishesha Brahman are the terms used by Shankara. Second, the world, Jagat, the personal God, Ishvara, and individual souls, jivas, are all empirically real. They're real from the vyavaharika standpoint, the transactional standpoint, which amounts to the standpoint of ignorance. So they're real so long as we haven't realized the highest truth, which is Brahman. But when we realize the highest truth of Brahman, they turn out to be ultimately non-existent. So from the paramatika standpoint, from the supreme standpoint, the absolute standpoint, none of these names and forms, it's not true that I'm speaking to you right now and giving this lecture. That's only true from the transactional standpoint, not from the ultimate standpoint. The fact that we have different individual souls sitting here now, also not true. There's only one non-dual self at the end of the day, and so on and so forth. Third main doctrine in Advaita Vedanta, we attain liberation, moksha, by attaining knowledge of our true nature as non-dual, pure consciousness. We are bound so long as we mistakenly identify with this body-mind complex, but when we realize the highest truth, which is that we are non-dual pure consciousness, we attain liberation. And in fact, we realize that we were already always liberated. Fourth, Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, is the only direct path to liberation. Okay, and I'm not going to go into detail here, but what is yoga? What is Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge? It's Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. So you should hear a Mahavakya, a great saying, like Tattvam Asi, I am Brahman, you are that Brahman. And then you have to do Manana, which means deep reflection, intellectual reflection on that teaching, removing the doubts in your mind. And then Nididhyasana, which is deep contemplation and meditation on that highest truth. Okay, and then fifth doctrine. What about other paths? Like Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion toward a personal God. Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action, where you offer everything you do to the personal God. These paths, Advaita Vedanta says, they're not completely useless. They're useful, but they're only indirect paths. They're preparatory disciplines meant to purify and concentrate the mind. And once you have a sufficiently pure mind, you have to stop practicing Bhakti Yoga, stop practicing Karma Yoga, and just focus on practicing the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. Okay? And then Jnana Yoga will take you to the highest goal. So Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga can never take you directly to the goal of liberation. It can indirectly help you by purifying your mind and then make you eligible to practice Jnana Yoga, which can take you to the highest goal. So now, I hope it's clear how Advaita Vedanta has an inclusivistic structure, right? Because Shankara is clearly placing Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, above the other yogas, above the path of devotion and the path of karma yoga, okay? So there's a hierarchy there. Jnana Yoga is the highest, other yogas are lower. Now, modern day Advaitins, who do I have in mind? I have people in mind like Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, T.M.P. Mahadevan, and a number of others. What they do is, of course, they're all writing in British colonial India. This is like early 20th century. And they're followers of Shankara, but what they do is they try to adapt Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, classical Advaita Vedanta, to modern times. And they try to kind of use Shankara's philosophical framework, but make it apply to all the different world religions. Because Shankara was not aware of Christianity, for instance. So he didn't talk about it, right? But you can still ask, how can we use Shankara's basic principles, Advaitic principles, to harmonize the world religions? And so that's what Radhakrishnan, that's what Mahadevan and others try to do. And I use this diagram to kind of capture the inclusivistic structure of how these modern day Advaitins explain the harmony of all the world religions. Now, this is how it looks on my understanding. Christians, through the practice of Christianity, can realize the Christian God, okay? But notice that they don't reach the top of the mountain. They're not at the peak, right? Muslims, through the practice of Islam, they can realize God as Allah. Wonderful. But again, notice they're not at the peak either. Theistic Hindus, so Vaishnavas, Shaktas, so on, they can realize God in many different forms as Rama, Krishna, Ganesha, Kali, Shiva, etc. They're also not at the peak of the mountain. Where are they? What exactly have they achieved? They've realized various forms of the personal God, Saguna Brahman, which is not sufficient for moksha. It's not sufficient for liberation. They have not yet been liberated from transmigratory existence, okay? To do that, the Christians need to stop practicing Christianity and take to the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, and only then will they reach the peak of Mount Everest, which is realizing their true nature as non-dual, pure consciousness, okay? Likewise for Muslims, likewise for theistic Hindus, and these are just representative samples, but of course we can take into account Judaism and many other religious traditions as well, but none of them, through their respective paths, can take us all the way to the peak of the mountain. So I hope that this diagram makes clear how this is inclusivistic in structure, right? There's a hierarchy here. Ultimately, every non-Advaitic religious path is in some sense inferior to, because it's only indirect compared to the path of knowledge. And I think it's a serious mistake to think that Ramakrishna harmonized the world religions using the framework of classical Advaita Vedanta, because then we're turning him into an inclusivist. And I think that his teachings on the harmony of religions are actually much more powerful, much more contemporary, and much more liberal than inclusivism, okay? So, his teachings on the harmony of religions are all grounded in a seminal distinction he draws between two different stages of spiritual experience, which he calls jnana and vijnana. So let me read this quotation from the Gospel. He says, the jnani here is a follower of the school of classical Advaita Vedanta, so a follower of Shankara. The jnani gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, neti, neti. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the divine reality, which is impersonal, nirguna, is also personal, saguna. This is known as vijnana. Okay, so there's a lot here to unpack. The jnani is the traditional Advaita Vedantin who attains spiritual realization of his or her true nature as non-dual pure consciousness through the practice of the path of knowledge, jnana yoga. But then Sri Ramakrishna says that's not the highest goal. Just attaining liberation is not the highest goal for some rare souls. He says there are some souls, which he calls Ishvara Kotis, divinely commissioned souls, who can go on to attain an even further state, which he calls Vijnana. And this Vijnani goes beyond the Advaita Jnani by realizing that Brahman is not only impersonal, nirguna, but also personal, saguna. Equally impersonal and personal. Or the two terms he uses typically are Brahman and Shakti. Okay. So by Brahman he means non-dual pure consciousness, and by Shakti he means the personal God. So while the Jnani dismisses the universe as a framework of illusion, dhokartati, so this should remind us of the classical Advaitic doctrine of Jagat Mithya, this world is an illusory appearance. He says the Vijnani, by contrast, embraces this world as a mansion of mirth, mojarkuti, because he sees this world as a real manifestation of Shakti, of the divine. Okay? So every name and form itself is a real manifestation of the divine. So now, in my published work, so in my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, in chapter 1 especially, I refer to his philosophy as Vijnana Vedanta, because I see Sri Ramakrishna as developing a new school of Vedantic thought, grounded in his unique spiritual experience of Vijnana. Okay. And it has these three core doctrines. If you want more details, please look at that chapter in my book. But first doctrine, the sole reality is the infinite divine reality, which is the impersonal, non-dual Brahman in one aspect, and the personal God, Shakti, in another aspect. Brahma or Shakti Abhed. That's the Bengali teaching. He says elsewhere in the Gospel, Jokhon tini nishkriya tokhon ami Brahma bole koi. So when that divine reality is inactive, nishkriya, then I call it Brahman. Jokhon tini sthiti prolay korchen tokhon ami take Shakti bole koi. When that same divine reality is creating, preserving, and destroying this world, then I call it Shakti or Kali. So difference in aspects. The static aspect of the divine reality is non-dual pure consciousness. The dynamic aspect of that same divine reality is Shakti. Okay. Second, the world and all individual souls are real manifestations of Shakti. One thing that, after my book was published, some people misunderstood me to be claiming that Vijnana Vedanta is not a non-dual philosophy. It is definitely it is non-dual. It's a non-dual philosophy, but it's a different kind of non-dualism from Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. So Shankara's non-dual philosophy is not the only form of non-duality that is present in Indian spiritual traditions. In fact, if you know something about Tantra and Kashmiri Shaivism, that's also non-dual. But it's a distinct form of non-duality from Shankara's non-dual philosophy. Likewise, Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta is a non-dual philosophy, but it's distinct from Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. What's distinct about it? Sri Ramakrishna uses a very pithy statement to capture what's unique about his non-dual philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. He says, Shob Jodiye Ekti, which means it's an all-embracing or all-encompassing oneness. It's a oneness. It's a divine oneness that does not exclude anything. So, as opposed to classical Advaita, which holds Brahma, Satyam, Jagat, Mithya, Vijnana Vedanta holds, I'm skipping to the bottom just for a second, Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. Okay? The ultimate reality is not just Brahman, not just pure consciousness, but is equally Shakti. So that's why I call it Brahma Shakti. And I hyphenate it as a phrase. Brahma Shakti Satyam. That alone is real. But Jagat Satyam, this world is also real. How? As a manifestation of Shakti. Because there's nothing but Shakti. So how can this world not be Shakti? That's the idea. Okay. Third doctrine. Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion toward the personal God. Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action, offering everything to the personal God. And Raja Yoga, the yoga of meditation and concentration, based usually on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. They are all direct paths to the goal of God realization. So notice how different this is from Shankara's school of classical Advaita Vedanta. According to Shankara, only one of those four yogas is the direct path to liberation. What was that? Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. According to Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, all four yogas are direct paths to liberation. And it's really a matter of temperament and preference which yoga you prefer to make the focus of your spiritual practice. Okay, so now, with all this in the background, we can now understand how Sri Ramakrishna harmonized the world religions. One of my favorite teachings is the following. He says, God is infinite and the paths to God are infinite. Tini ananto, patho ananto. Unlike some of his other formulations of the harmony of religions, like the most famous one is Joto mot toto pot, as many fades, so many paths, this teaching explains why there are infinite paths to the divine. There are infinite paths to the divine because the divine itself, or himself or herself, whatever you want to call the divine, it's everything, is infinite. Because the divine is infinite, the paths to the divine are equally infinite. So that's a very powerful and succinct statement, I think, that explains why there are infinite paths to God. So devotees of the personal God, bhaktas, through their respective theistic paths, it could be Christianity or Islam, Brahma Samaj, anything, Vaishnavism, they can realize some aspect or form of the personal, the Shakti dimension of the impersonal, personal, infinite divine reality. Advaita Vedantins, through the practice of Jnana Yoga, attain the non-dual realization of Brahman, the impersonal aspect of the same infinite divine reality. So they're realizing the same divine truth, but in different forms and aspects. That's the basic idea. And they're on an equal footing. So it's not inclusivism, it's an actual pluralism. Sri Ramakrishna uses a parable involving a chameleon to explain this harmony of the different religious traditions. He says, once a man entered a forest and saw a small animal on a tree. He came back and told another man that he had seen a creature of a beautiful red color on a certain tree. The second man replied, when I went into the forest, I also saw that animal. But why do you call it red? It is green. Another man who was present contradicted them both and insisted that it was yellow. Presently, others arrived and contended that it was gray, violet, blue, and so forth and so on. At last, they started quarreling among themselves. To settle the dispute, they all went to the tree. They saw a man sitting under it. On being asked, he replied, yes, I live under this tree, and I know the animal very well. All your descriptions are true. Sometimes it appears red, sometimes yellow, and at other times blue, violet, gray, and so forth. It is a chameleon. And sometimes it has no color at all. Now it has a color, and now it has none. In like manner, this is Sri Ramakrishna's moral to this whole parable. In like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. That person alone knows that God reveals himself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God is personal as well as impersonal. Only the man who lives under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and he knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument. So here again, there's a lot of philosophical content that needs to be unpacked. I want to draw your attention to 4 key features of this parable. First, the different colors of the chameleon, blue, green, yellow, red, and so forth, correspond to different forms of the personal God. So the red chameleon can be Christ, the yellow chameleon can be Krishna, and so on and so forth. Second, the colorless chameleon, what do you think that represents? This corresponds to impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness. Attributeless, non-dual, pure consciousness, which is the conception of the ultimate in Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. Okay. So he takes that into account as well. But 3, notice that in the parable, because he's thinking about a chameleon here, right? It doesn't make sense to say that the chameleon without color is somehow more real or more true to itself than the red chameleon or the yellow chameleon, right? So the colorless chameleon is in no way more true than the colored chameleon, which means that the bhakta's realization of the personal God has the same status, the same value, and the same truth as the jnani's realization of non-dual pure consciousness. Okay, so there's no higher and lower as there are in inclusivistic philosophies. And 4, this strange person who's constantly sitting under the tree, who lives under the tree presumably 24 hours a day. In the US, they call these people tree sitters. They're usually activists who are trying to save these trees from being cut down. So they live in the tree. Okay, so this guy might be something like a tree sitter. He says, I see the chameleon, sometimes it's red, sometimes it's yellow, sometimes it's blue, sometimes it's colorless, right? So who is this mysterious person? The Vijnani. This is the person who has attained this expansive spiritual realization of Vijnana, and who has actually realized the divine in many different forms and aspects. right? So Sri Ramakrishna harmonizes all of the world's religious and spiritual paths, specifically and explicitly on the basis of Vijnana. I hope that's clear from this parable. So now, what would a diagrammatic representation of Ramakrishna's pluralist harmonizing of the world religions look like? This is my suggestion. Christians, through the practice of Christianity, can directly reach the top of the mountain, the peak of Mount Everest, which is defined by Ramakrishna as the realization, the liberative realization of some aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality, which leads directly to the highest fulfillment and liberation, moksha, liberation from transmigratory existence. Likewise for Muslims, likewise for Hindus, theistic Hindus, I have in mind, Advaita Vedantins, who believe in pure consciousness, and even Buddhists. All of them can directly reach the peak of the mountain through their respective religious paths, whether they're theistic paths or non-theistic paths. And there's no higher and lower. So I hope it's clear why this is not an inclusivistic structure. This is a pluralistic structure that puts multiple religious paths on an equal, what's called salvific footing, which means they have an equal chance at bringing us to the highest goal of salvation or liberation. Okay, another really unique feature, I think, of Ramakrishna's harmony of the world religions is that he has a very expansive conception of the final state of liberation. This is a question that comes up. When you study the different schools of Indian philosophy, there's usually a section in any chapter on an Indian school on moksha. What is the state of liberation? Advaita Vedanta says liberation is very simple. There's no eternal heaven, there's no coming and going. You just rest in your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. And that's it. And you realize everything else is an illusion. Theists, any theistic religious tradition, most of them, they hold that the state of liberation looks very different. It's dwelling in an eternal heaven with your beloved personal God. Okay? And crucially, whereas Advaita Vedanta places this goal of resting in your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness on a higher footing and says that there is no eternal heaven. At best, there are kind of temporary heavens. They call it Brahmaloka. And some liberated some souls, they're not yet liberated, they might dwell in this eternal heaven for some time. They don't have to come back to this earth. But after some time, eventually they have to merge into non-dual pure consciousness. They can't rest in an eternal heaven for the rest of their, for an eternity. Okay? But Ramakrishna says both the form of liberation of dwelling in an eternal heaven and the other form of liberation, the Advaitic form of liberation, where you rest in your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, are on an equal footing. Both are equally true, and both are equally valuable. And Ramakrishna uses a charming metaphor to capture this involving sugar. He says that bhaktas, devotees, they don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. So eating sugar is the paradigm of dwelling in an eternal heaven with the form of your beloved personal God, whether that's Krishna or Christ or so on. And Advaitins and some forms of Buddhism, when you attain liberation, what happens? There's no eternal heaven, but what you get is you can become sugar. You just want to be non-dual pure consciousness, and so that's what you'll get. Okay? Okay, but notice, whether you become sugar or eat sugar, it's a matter of temperament or preference. It's not a question of higher and lower. And it's not mandatory for everybody to become sugar. There are just these two fundamentally different states of liberation. And since there are various lokas, loka is a Sanskrit term for realm, these eternal realms, there are also multiple theistic forms of salvation, of liberation. So for instance, while devotees of Krishna can dwell eternally with their beloved Krishna in Goloka, so that's what they call heaven, Goloka. Christians can dwell with Christ or God the Father in their Christian heaven. Muslims can commune with Allah in their eternal paradise. They call it Jannah, and so on. So, importantly, Ramakrishna was not only a religious pluralist, that in the sense that I defined earlier, who held that different religious paths are equally capable of leading to the highest fulfillment, but he was also a salvific pluralist. He was a pluralist about different states of salvation or liberation, because he held that liberation itself takes a variety of forms, depending on the temperament and preferences of different souls. And so one metaphor that I like to use is, according to Sri Ramakrishna, the state of liberation is like a many-roomed mansion. Okay, so a mansion has, let's say, 100 different rooms. And it's infinitely expandable. You can keep renovating and adding more rooms. And so the liberated Christian will enter the Christian room. The liberated Muslim will enter the Muslim room. The liberated Vaishnava will enter the Vaishnava room called Goloka. And so there are these different theistic rooms. The Advaitins will just dwell in their true natures as non-dual pure consciousness. And that's a different Advaitic room, and so on. But just as right now I'm giving a talk to you here, but there are many other people on campus in different buildings, right? So just as it's perfectly reasonable and logical to say that there are people inhabiting different rooms in the same campus, why can't the state of liberation be like that? Why can't it be plural, equally plural? And why can't this be Goloka, for instance, and in the next room you have the Christian heaven, and another one you have Jannah, the Muslim heaven, and so on and so forth. So not all liberated souls have to live for an eternity together, thank God, because that might be hell. Okay, now, every theory of religious pluralism faces a serious problem, okay? And this is when philosophers try to justify a religious pluralism, they have to tackle this problem. It's called the problem of conflicting religious truth claims, okay? It's very intuitive. The idea is that different religions make claims which are sometimes conflicting, that conflict with each other. And so if we affirm the truth of all the different religious paths, aren't we falling into contradictions? What's a simple example? Did Christ die on the cross? Christianity says yes, obviously. That's at the core of their religion. Muslims, Islam, says no. Christ was not the Son of God. He was a prophet, but he was not the Son of God, and he did not die on the cross. Okay, so that's an example of a conflicting religious truth claim, right? But there are many other examples. The doctrines of karma and rebirth, which Hindus believe, Buddhists believe, Jainas believe, Sikhs believe, right? But Orthodox Abrahamic religions, like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, they don't believe in karma and rebirth, right? There again, we have a conflicting religious truth claim. So if Ramakrishna is claiming that Christianity and Islam and Judaism and Hinduism and Buddhism are all equally true, he would be falling into contradictions. Because then he would literally be forced to say, yes, Christ did die on the cross because he accepts Christianity. And yes, Christ did not die on the cross because he accepts Islam. Yes, karma and rebirth are true because he believes in Hinduism and Buddhism. And no, karma and rebirth are false because he also accepts Christianity and Islam and Judaism, right? Okay, so crucially, Ramakrishna, this is why it's so important to keep in mind that Ramakrishna does not actually claim that all the doctrines of all the different world religions are true. Because if he did hold that view, he would fall into contradictions left and right. Rather, his claim is that all religions, all the major world religions, even if some of their doctrines are not true, are equally capable of leading to the highest fulfillment. They're equally valid or efficacious paths to the same goal of realizing the divine in some form or aspect. That's the nuance that's really important to keep in mind here. So now, to help us get a better and more kind of detailed understanding of how he handles this problem of conflicting religious truth claims, I think it helps to bring in John Hick's classification of 3 different types of conflicting religious truth claim. First, disagreements about past historical events that are in principle accessible to human observation. So an example would be, did Christ die on the cross? Because if at time 0, there was that video cameras existed, for instance, somebody could have just taped that cross and just seen whether Christ actually was crucified or not. Of course, there wasn't one at the time, but in principle, it's accessible to human observation. Somebody who was there at the time could have verified whether Christ died on the cross or not. Okay, but there are 2 other kinds of disagreement. Another is disagreements about trans-historical matters, which cannot be verified by historical or other empirical evidence. And so one example that one might give, this is slightly controversial, but is the doctrine of karma, for instance. Is there direct empirical evidence for the truth of karma? Probably not. I mean, some people might argue that there is, but for the purpose of this presentation, let's just stipulate that there isn't. So this can be called a trans-historical dispute. And the Orthodox Abrahamic religions deny the truth of these doctrines, karma and rebirth, whereas Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and so on affirm the truth of these doctrines, right? They disagree with each other. Third kind of disagreement, disagreements about ultimate questions, such as the nature of ultimate reality. So what is the nature of the divine, of God, of the highest truth? And you all know that different religious traditions disagree about these questions. Now, I would suggest that Sri Ramakrishna handles the first two types of conflicting religious truth claims in one way, and he handles the third type in a different way. So I'm going to handle them one at a time. So numbers 1 and 2, how does he handle them? He gives as an example, you find this in the gospel, he says, was Krishna's Gopi Leela a real historical event? So Krishna sporting with the milkmaids. Did that actually happen in history, in Vrindavan? Okay. Vaishnavas, of course, say yes. But there are many others who deny it, who think that even if you can still worship Krishna, but they don't think that this actually happened in the historical past on this earth, for instance. And during Sri Ramakrishna's time, there's a whole movement called the Brahma Samaj, which was a Hindu reform movement, which denied any form of God. So they didn't believe that God could incarnate in human form, so they didn't believe in Krishna, but they believed in the formless but personal God. Okay. And so Sri Ramakrishna would often raise this issue, precisely because he knew that Brahma Samaj followers like Keshav Chandra Sen, others, Bijay Krishna Goswami, they didn't believe in incarnations and in this Leela, this Gopi Leela. Okay. So what he would tell them is, it doesn't matter. He tells his Brahma Samaj people, don't worry, you don't need to accept the truth of the Gopi Leela, but there's still something to learn from Vaishnavism. Dan Tukunebe, he says, you should learn from Vaishnavism the longing for God that you have to have in order to realize God. That intense longing that Radha feels for Krishna. We should try to have that in our own spiritual life. Okay. An example of a disagreement about a transhistorical matter, is the doctrine of karma true? Okay. And again, Ramakrishna is very broad about this. He even says for Hindus, not all Hindus have to believe in karma and rebirth. How do we know this? Because in the Gospel, M, the author of the Kathamrita, he asked Sri Ramakrishna early on in the Gospel, he says, I don't really believe in purva janma samskaras, in latent mental impressions accrued from previous births. Is that going to harm me in any way? And he says, no. It's totally fine for you not to believe in karma and rebirth. It's not that, you're beyond the pale, that you don't count as a Hindu because you don't believe in karma and rebirth. No. In fact, I gave a lecture a few months ago called Is Vedanta Hindu? And I explained the core doctrines of Hinduism. And then I add what's called Hinduism Plus, which are two more doctrines. And one of those doctrines is karma and rebirth. Because you can be a Hindu and not believe in karma and rebirth. But it's helpful if you can accept the whole package, which is mentioned in the Gita and these other Hindu scriptures. Okay, so now, what is Ramakrishna's take on conflicting historical truth claims and conflicting transhistorical truth claims? He uses the metaphor of a watch. He says, everyone thinks his watch is right, but as a matter of fact, no watch is absolutely correct. No watch is perfect, but that doesn't hamper one's work. So this is pre-GPS and smartphones and all that. So now actually every watch is more or less perfect, or close to perfect, thanks to modern technology. But in his time, no. They're all off by at least a few seconds, right? And yet, don't they get the job done? They still help you to meet, make your appointments and to get your job. So in the same way, he says, no religion is 100% true. There's going to be some untruths, some degree of mixture of error and truth in every religious path. But those untruths and those errors don't significantly handicap that religious tradition from the standpoint of being an effective path to liberation or salvation. That's the important thing. They can still get the job done, like your watch does, even if it doesn't tell the exact time. Okay. Now, what about his stance on that third type of conflicting truth claim, claims about ultimate reality? From his spiritual standpoint of Vijnana, religious truth claims about the ultimate reality are complementary rather than conflicting. So notice how his stance on this third type of conflicting truth claim is very different from his stance on 1 and 2. And he used a different parable to explain this. The parable, it's a very common parable, which many of you are probably familiar with. I'll explain it very quickly. There's a giant elephant, and there are 5 blind men. Each of them is touching a different part of that same elephant. So the person touching the tail says, yes, I know what this elephant is like. It's soft and furry. And the person touching the trunk says, you're a fool. I'm touching this elephant, and I know that the elephant is dry and scaly. And then all these 5 blind people are arguing with each other and calling each other dumb. And then there's one person who has vision, who's not blind, who can see the whole elephant, and says, stop your quarreling, because you're all right in a certain sense, and you're all wrong in another sense. You're all right because you're touching parts of the same elephant. But you're wrong in limiting the elephant to what you have experienced or realized of that elephant. Never limit the highest truth to what you have realized. Okay? And the Vijnani is in a unique position to say this because that Vijnani has actually realized the divine in different forms and aspects. That Vijnani has realized God as Christ, as Krishna, as Ganesha, as Kali, and so on, and as non-dual pure consciousness. So that person is in a unique epistemic position to adjudicate conflicts among the world's religious practitioners, right? This is a really unique aspect of his position. So all the different religious claims about the ultimate truth, that reality is non-dual pure consciousness, according to Shankara, that reality is Krishna, according to Vaishnavas, that reality is Kali, according to Shaktas, that reality is Christ, according to Christians, Allah, according to Muslims. All of them can be true. And they're all actually complementary conceptions of the same ultimate reality. That's the idea. Okay. Now, even after having said all of this, it's logically possible for you to be a religious pluralist in Ramakrishna's sense, which means you can believe that there are many different paths to the same goal, each of them is equally effective, and at the same time, let's say that I'm a Hindu, which I am. I can still be perfectly content with my Hindu path and not bother about learning about any other religious path in the world. That's perfectly logical. And I'll say, yeah, you Christians are great. You practice Christianity. I'll practice my Hinduism. You Muslims are great. You practice your Islam. I'll practice my Hinduism. And I still might not feel the need to learn from other religious paths, okay? So religious pluralism by itself does not necessitate learning from other religions. However, I think that Sri Ramakrishna, and especially his chief disciple, Swami Vivekananda, deepen their religious pluralist position into what I call a religious cosmopolitanism, okay? It's a fancy polysyllabic term, but it means something pretty simple. This is the idea that we can and should strive to learn from religions other than our own, and even try to incorporate aspects of other traditions into our own spiritual practice. So we should not just rest content with religious pluralism, we should actually become religious cosmopolitans. And Swami Vivekananda, based on Ramakrishna's teachings, gives a number of reasons as to why we should be religious cosmopolitans, and I'll just mention a few of them. Number one, since different religions provide different but complementary accounts of one and the same infinite divine reality, every religious practitioner can enrich and broaden her understanding of God by learning about other religions. Simple example, there are 7 continents in this world, okay? And let's say that I've lived in the US all my life. How do I know more about the world? Well, I should visit other continents. Let me come to India, and let me go to Russia, and let me go to China. And then I gain a broader and a truer and more expansive understanding of this world. Likewise, we can gain a more expansive and deeper and truer understanding of the ultimate reality by exposing ourselves to and learning from religious traditions other than our own. Like the blind men. So imagine the blind men touching the different parts of the elephant. If the blind man touching the tail says to the guy touching the trunk, hey, come over to my side, and you'll experience this elephant in a different way, right? Then that person becomes a religious cosmopolitan. Second reason why we should deepen our religious pluralism into a religious cosmopolitanism is that every religion has a unique soul, which Vivekananda defines as a particular excellence. There's something uniquely great about every world religious tradition. And he goes on to specify that the soul of Islam is universal brotherhood, the soul of Hinduism is God realization, and the soul of Christianity is purification of mind through social service. Now, again, all of you can think for yourselves about what the soul of each religion is. You can even argue with Vivekananda and say, no, I think the soul of Islam is so-and-so. That's fine. But try to understand the main gist of what he's saying. Since the souls of all religions are supplementary, by which he means complementary, rather than contradictory, we should strive to enrich our own spiritual life by assimilating the unique soul of every religion. And third reason he gives for being religious cosmopolitans is that each world religion corresponds to one or more of the 4 yogas. What are the 4 yogas? Bhakti yoga, karma yoga, jnana yoga, and karma yoga. So we can best harmonize the 4 yogas by being religious cosmopolitans. Okay. What does he mean? every one of these 4 yogas is a direct path to liberation, he says. And then he says that every world religion corresponds to one or more of these 4 yogas. Okay. Some of them might combine multiple yogas, but the idea is that it corresponds at least to one of these yogas. And at the same time, the human personality is made up of many different elements or components or dimensions. So each of these yogas helps to cultivate a different aspect of the human personality. Okay. And so Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion, helps to cultivate the emotional side of our nature. Karma Yoga helps to cultivate the dynamic volitional side of our nature, will, right? Jnana Yoga helps to cultivate the intellectual side. Raja Yoga helps to cultivate the faculty of concentration and meditation. And so if we can combine all 4 yogas in our spiritual life, in our day-to-day spiritual life, then we can be running on all cylinders, basically. We can make most effective use of all of our spiritual energy, basically, and of all those different packets of energy within us can be properly utilized. And on a global scale, since each of the world religions corresponds to one or more of these 4 yogas, the more we're able to learn from and incorporate other religions into our own path, the more harmoniously balanced we'll be as human beings and as spiritual practitioners. So this is the way he puts it. Swami Vivekananda says, we want to become harmonious beings with the psychical, spiritual, intellectual, and working active sides of our nature equally developed. We must be as broad as the skies, as deep as the ocean. We must become many-sided. Indeed, we must become protean in character, so as not only to tolerate, but to do what is much more difficult, to sympathize, to enter into another's path, and feel with him in his aspirations and seeking after God. And Fritjof Schuon, some of you might be familiar with him, he wrote a book called The Transcendent Unity of Religions. And he says something along the same lines and was in fact influenced to some extent by Swami Vivekananda and Vedanta. He says, the truth is that every religious form is superior to the others in a particular respect. Okay? Each world religious tradition has something unique to teach us, something truly great, which it explains in such a beautiful way that other religions don't explain in as nice a way. And so there's something to learn from every religious path, basically. So Swami Vivekananda captures this whole religious cosmopolitan paradigm in these stirring words. He says, our watchword then will be acceptance and not exclusion. I accept all religions that were in the past and worship with them all. I worship God with every one of them, in whatever form they worship him. I shall go to the mosque of the Mohammedan. I shall enter the Christian's church and kneel before the crucifix. I shall enter the Buddhistic temple, where I shall take refuge in Buddha and in his law. I shall go into the forest and sit down in meditation with the Hindu, who is trying to see the light which enlightens the heart of everyone. Not only shall I do all these, but I shall keep my heart open for all that may come in the future. We stand in the present, but open ourselves to the infinite future. We take in all that has been in the past, enjoy the light of the present, and open every window of the heart for all that will come in the future. Now, one thing that I want to bring your attention to here is that he says, this religious pluralism in this religious cosmopolitanism is not just confined to the existing religions now. 1,000 or 10,000 years from now, there will surely be new spiritual traditions. Even those can be effective. And he says something really radical in a number of places. He says, no person is born into a religion. Each person has a unique religion in the depths of his or her soul. And in spiritual life, we should try to discover what that unique religion is in the depths of our soul, which is unique to us, to me, just to me. And you have a different religion that's unique to you. We can all be Hindus, for instance. And yet each Hindu may have a different custom-built religion that's tailored to that particular individual. And the best way to discover what that custom-made religion is, that belongs to us alone, that's most effective for us, is to expose ourselves to the world's religious traditions. So that what happens when we do that is we become religious cosmopolitans we're firmly rooted in our own home spiritual tradition, but we can freely learn from other traditions. And if, like for instance, I like Buddhist mindfulness, for instance. So I've incorporated that mindfulness practice into my own spiritual practice as a Hindu. In Christianity, I love sacred classical music, for instance. So the great classical compositions of Bach and Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms and others. So that's part of my spiritual practice, right? That doesn't mean I suddenly become a Christian. You can be a Hindu and also incorporate aspects of these other religious traditions as a religious cosmopolitan. And by doing that, you can actually kind of custom build your home religious tradition, and you can kind of tailor it to your own individual needs and preferences. That's the basic idea. Okay. I'm going to skip a few slides because I don't think we have time. It was about on Sri Ramakrishna's practice of Christianity. But I'll just end my presentation here. If you want a more in-depth discussion and defense of Ramakrishna's philosophy of religious pluralism, please look at chapters 3 and 4 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. And there was a book symposium published on this book in 2021, published in the International Journal of Hindu Studies, and there were 13 professors from across the world who wrote responses to my book, and then I wrote a final response to their responses. So that was a really fun project, and I learned a lot from it. And I even modified some of my views in light of their criticisms and suggestions. And for a discussion of Swami Vivekananda's views on religious pluralism and religious cosmopolitanism, please look at chapter 3 of the book that was published a couple of years ago by Oxford called Swami Vivekananda's Vedāntic Cosmopolitanism. Thank you. Okay, so now I think it's time for Q&A, yeah. Should I sit here or?
Yes, you can. Thank you, Swamiji, for your profound and insightful talk. I'm sure Swamiji's words have stirred up a lot of curiosity among the audience. The floor is now open for questions, and we would try to accommodate as many as possible in the next 15 minutes. So those who would like to ask, please raise your hands, and one of our volunteers would come to you with a mic.
And can you bring a mic here, or should I?
I'll give a mic there, yeah.
This is the man.
Now it's on, yeah. Okay, so questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Swamiji, for the insightful talk. I mean, I've heard you previously as well on YouTube and all. So the two...
What's your name, by the way?
I'm Shayok. I'm doing my PhD in the electrical engineering department.
Thanks.
So the two key takeaways that I understand from Vijnana Vedanta is that Brahma Satya and Jagat Satya as well. And this all paths lead to the same reality. My first question is that how do you reconcile the two of them? Because if we talk about Advaita Vedanta, if you're talking about one supreme consciousness and realizing that supreme consciousness as self is is what liberation means, that sort of makes sense in my mind. But how do I see myself as this whole world, and also have a personal God, and reaching that personal God as the supreme reality? And how do I reconcile the two of them together?
Okay, yeah, thanks for that question, yeah. So I actually tried to answer that question earlier in the presentation. The idea is that the conception of ultimate reality in Vijnana Vedanta is much broader than that of classical Advaita Vedanta. So the way that you explained it right now is, actually you were explaining classical Advaita Vedanta rather than Vijnana Vedanta. You're saying, well, if we take pure consciousness to be the non-dual truth, then how is it possible? But that's not, but Ramakrishna doesn't accept that premise. So, whereas Shankara, so Sri Ramakrishna, he had this teaching. He would say, Bhagavana kono iti nai. You should never place a limit to God, to the divine. And I think that what he would say to Shankara is, wonderful, I fully accept your non-dual pure consciousness, but why do you limit Brahman to just non-dual pure consciousness? Brahman is equally Shakti. Brahman is inseparable from Shakti. So the Vijnana Vedanta conception of ultimate reality is not just non-dual pure consciousness or the non-dual self. It's Brahma Shakti. Remember, in the Sanskrit formula, it's not actually Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. It's Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. Okay? And remember the other thing I said. Shankara's Advaita Vedanta does not have a monopoly on non-dualism. This is something, I think because Shankara is so hegemonic and so popular and so prestigious across the world, at least in the context of Indian philosophies, that the moment you hear non-duality, you just equate non-dualism with Shankara. But as I said, Kashmiri Shaivism is a non-Shankarite form of non-duality. So is Tantra. there's Shakta Advaita, there's a Shakta form of Advaita, and so is Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. It's just a different kind of non-duality. It's an all-embracing oneness that accepts the reality of jivas, individual souls, and all these different names and forms as real manifestations of the same Shakti. Thank you. Yes. And if you have another question, we can come back later. Yeah, I'm sure we have plenty of time.
Thank you, Swamiji, for such a wonderful talk. I had two questions. One thing, when you talk about Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, but Shankara is also the one who actually, composed Saundarya Lahiri, where he extols the virtues of Shakti. And, he also had the Vaj Govindam, where, he says that what's there in this mind juggling, you just go and, practice devotion. So is it fair to say that Shankara, of course, he did, write commentary on Brahma Sutras and all of that, but is it fair to say that that's the version he actually expounded, or is it just that his followers stuck to that version and, kind of ignored the other things that he said?
Yeah, this is a great question. I get this question a lot. And so this is my response. See, okay, yes, it's true that traditionally Shankara is held to be the author of devotional texts like Mohamudgara. It's popularly known as Bhaja Govindam, but it's actually called Mohamudgara. And Saundarya Lahiri, and there are other ones. Now, I honestly don't know, and I don't think any of us in this room can say for sure whether Shankara actually authored those devotional compositions. Now, so there are two possibilities. One is he was the author of those compositions. Let's just say that he was. We're not out of the woods yet. Even if we accept that he was the author of those compositions, the problem is we know for sure that he authored the commentaries on the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutra. And we know what he said there about bhakti. And we know that it contradicts what he says in his Saundarya Lahiri and the Bhaja Govindam. So now, good luck trying to reconcile what he says about bhakti and all the flattering things he says about bhakti with the much less flattering things he says about devotion and the personal God in his Brahma Sutra Bhashya, for instance. Okay. In the other case, if he was not the author of Bhaja Govindam and Saundarya Lahiri, then we just rely on the commentaries. And what I gave you in the presentation was a textbook 101 account of what he says in the commentaries, which we know he wrote. So if it's uncertain whether he composed the devotional hymns and it's certain that he did compose the commentaries, certainly we should rely on the commentaries. Now, even if he was a great devotee, a bhakta who composed Bhaja Govindam, you still need to reconcile what he says about bhakti with what he says about bhakti in the commentaries. And so there are ways to do it. One way is to say that it would be called like a diachronic interpretation. You would say that early in his life, he was an extreme classical Advaitin. He didn't believe in bhakti, and he put the personal God on a lower footing. Later in his life, he became more devotional, and he came to accept the reality of Shakti. In fact, in the life of Sri Ramakrishna, when he was doing Advaitic sadhana with Totapuri, Totapuri did not accept Shakti. He didn't believe in the personal God. And he would make fun of Ramakrishna for clapping his hands to Mother Kali. And he said, "What are you, making chapatis?" Right? Then what happens? After Ramakrishna attains Nirvikalpa Samadhi and realizes Brahman, he turns around and becomes guru to his own guru. He becomes guru to Totapuri. And there's a whole story about how Totapuri has a terrible stomach ache and he's having dysentery and it's incurable. And he goes to commit suicide because he says, "I've already realized Brahman, so good riddance to this body." And he finds strangely that he couldn't kill himself, that the water wasn't deep enough for him to actually drown. And then, in this kind of mystical experience, he is forced to accept Divine Mother, accept Shakti. So you can say, now coming back to Shankara, you might say, earlier in his life, he composed these commentaries, later he composed the devotional hymns. But again, that's speculative. I mean, how can we prove that? So you might want to make a case for that. I'd be open to seeing the historical evidence and otherwise for that. But right now, I think that the safest route is to rely on what he says in the commentaries and take that to be authoritative. Thank you.
So my second question was, you gave this example of multiple chambers, right? Where there's a Christian chamber, there's
many-roomed mansion.
Many-room mansions, something like that. So, if you look at the yoga tradition, when you talk about yoga, chitta, vritti, nirodh, how will that, be reconciled with this particular view that you had kind of,
Right. Well, that's great. Yeah, that's a nice question. So, how do we reconcile Patanjali's yoga philosophy in this many-room mansion? What will that room in the mansion look like? Well, I would put Patanjali's yoga philosophy in the same category as Sankhya, on which it's based, and Jainism. And the reason is that all of those schools, all of those philosophical traditions believe that we are an eternal Purusha, or soul, Atman, separate, an individual Atman, separate from the body-mind complex. And that liberation consists in realizing our true nature as an individual Purusha separate from the body-mind complex. Sankhya believes that, Yoga believes that, and so does Jainism. Okay? And so that's the room, is that you dwell in the room where you identify with the individual Purusha. That's the basic idea, which is eternally liberated. Yes, other questions? Yeah, plenty of hands up. We have plenty of time, so everyone will get a chance.
Namaste Swamiji.
Namaste. Well, tell me your name and then ask the question.
जी मेरा नाम शुभम है. जो मुझे एक चीज़ पूछनी है कि
Okay, I don't know Hindi, so somebody else needs to translate, or you can speak in English. Yeah.
I can also talk in
Okay,
English.
thanks.
So first of all thing is that Atma and Paramatma are different or one.
Oh, both. That's a
How
good
can
question.
it be both?
Yeah, well, good, right. Okay, so I gave the Sanskrit formula for classical Advaita Vedanta as Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha, right? So in classical Advaita Vedanta, the individual soul is identical with non-dual pure consciousness, right? They give a very simple answer to the question that you're asking. And then you might be wondering, well, when I gave the Sanskrit formula for Vijnana Vedanta, I said Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. But then what about the relationship between Jiva and Brahman? I leave that blank. So now let me fill that in. In the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna was fond of quoting Hanuman. Hanuman would tell Rama, there's a famous Sanskrit shloka to capture this, his attitude. He says, Deha buddhya dasosmi, jiva buddhya twadamshakaha, atma buddhya tvamevaham iti me nishchitamatihi. Hanuman tells his beloved Rama, when I think of myself as the physical body, then I say I am your servant and you are my master. When I identify with the Jivatma, the eternal individual soul, then I say I am an amsha, a portion of you, O Rama. And when I Atma Buddhya, when I identify with the supreme Atman, then I say I am you, you are me. And so all of these different relationships with the divine are equally true, actually, at different levels or planes of consciousness. That's the idea. Okay.
But we cannot say like we are the part of the Brahma.
How come?
Because if we are a part of that Brahma, then their quality will become us qualities. But definitely we are different because we are not all powerful, not all knowing, we are not all just, but that Ishwar or Parabrahma or Paramatma is all powerful, all knowing and all just.
Right. Yeah, right. But that's because we identify with the body-mind complex, right? But God is also Antaryami, dwelling within us. What if we can identify with the God in our heart? Do you see what I mean? Then, see, I'm Medhananda in this empirical personality, sitting here talking to you now. It's not Medhananda as Medhananda who is identical with God. But when Medhananda realizes God within his heart, who is omniscient and omnipotent and perfect, then it's perfectly reasonable to say that I am God. God playfully manifesting in the body of Medhananda, for instance, right? That would be the realization.
So at this time, there is a God and there is a potential God.
What is a potential God? What do you mean by
because if I know myself then I can become him also. So
yeah, but
as
again,
you said,
we're already him. We are already God. We just don't know it.
But then there is two God. Or there is multiple gods also. But
No, there's
God
just,
is one.
There's one God, and there's either a state of ignorance and there's a state of knowledge. Right now we're in the state of ignorance. We don't know that we're God. In the state of knowledge, we'll realize that we were always God, playing in the form of all of us, each of us here. That's the idea.
Thank you.
Your name, please.
Yeah, Pranam Swamiji. Thank you for the excellent talk. My name is Shalini. I have a slight discomfort with the chameleon analogy.
With the which analogy?
The chameleon analogy,
Chameleon,
different colors of the chameleon. So my limited understanding of Advaita Vedanta tells me that a blue chameleon, a green chameleon, a red, a yellow, and a colorless chameleon. So we said, in the context of arguing for pluralism, we said that it's not that a colorless one is superior to the other, or a colorless chameleon, so to say, Advaitic is superior to the colored ones, which we are calling probably bhakti or the other devotional or other religious below Advaitic. But my understanding of Advait tells me that the colorless chameleon is not what we should refer to as Advaitic. Advaitic means what is common behind all these. Be them, as in be it a colored chameleon or a colorless chameleon. What is common reality behind all of them? And so that probably is,
Keep the mic closer to
beyond the pluralism that we are talking about in this.
Okay. Okay, so what is that common element in the chameleon?
Yes, that, to my understanding, that is the ultimate reality or pure consciousness.
No, I know, but in the metaphor of the chameleon, what would that look like?
In the metaphor of the chameleon, a colorless chameleon is just another chameleon which is colorless. It's no different from any other.
I know what you're saying, but what I mean is, in order to sustain your interpretation, you have to actually explain the state of the chameleon that is the common ground of both all the colors of the chameleon and the colorless chameleon.
So that state is
it just is the chameleon, right?
No, so I'm saying that state is pure consciousness, which is common behind all of these. And when it takes a name, shape, form, color, function,
right?
That's when the
I see. So, what you're doing there is interpreting the chameleon parable from the standpoint of Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta, and you can do that, but I don't think it's a plausible interpretation of Ramakrishna's teachings, and because he explicitly denies that the non-dual self or non-dual pure consciousness is somehow truer or a more fundamental reality than the different forms of the personal God. He gives an example, for instance. He says, imagine a vast, infinite ocean of Satchit Ananda. And he says, under the cooling influence of the breeze of bhakti, of devotion, that ocean forms into ice, different formations of ice. Each of those forms of ice corresponds to different forms of the personal God. One of them might be Christ, another one might be Ganesha, another one might be Krishna, and so on. Then he says, with the rising of the sun of knowledge, those ice forms melt. Okay? And so at this point, the parable or the metaphor will support your view, right? Once the ice form melts, what you have is the deeper fundamental truth, which is the infinite, non-dual, pure consciousness. Then he says, in some places, the ice doesn't melt at all. It becomes like quartz, spotikerakar. He says, nitya shakar, nitya sakara. There are some forms of God that are eternal and which never melt, which means that they are equally fundamental to non-dual pure consciousness. And that's why he can affirm that the theistic state of liberation in an eternal heaven is as valuable and as real as the state of dwelling in your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. So it's different fundamental presuppositions, basically. That's the idea.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So the price that you pay for the view that you're explaining is inclusivism. It means that you have to put Advaita on a higher footing than the theistic traditions. And no. I'm not saying that. I'm not criticizing. What I'm saying is, if you want a robust religious pluralism, then you need to accept a more expansive conception of ultimate reality to be impersonal, personal, and Brahman Shakti rather than just as non-dual pure consciousness. That's the idea.
Namaste Swamiji. Like my question is also in continuation with the previous one. So even in classical Advaita Vedanta, right? So Shakti is not denied because they have this concept of Maya as the Vikshepa Shakti and Avarana Shakti. So the Jagat appears through the through Maya or Shakti only. But that ultimately it is when they say Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, so it's that the appearance as this of this world is a mithya, but the Satchit Anand is the common element. And then even in the next line itself, they say Jiva Brahmaiva Napara. So ultimately, you are reconciling everything as Brahman, right? So I think Swami Sarvapriyananda ji also uses this phrase a lot, that 2 steps to Advaita Vedanta. So first step is realizing that everything is an appearance and you are the true reality as the consciousness, existence, consciousness, place. And the second step is to reconcile that that even whatever is appearing is the manifestation of same Satchit Anand through that Maya. So isn't Shankara already doing that?
Okay, so this is, good question. I've heard it before. Part of the problem here is you're mixing up Shankara with post-Shankara classical Advaita. Because Shankara doesn't talk about Vikshepa Shakti or Avarana Shakti. He doesn't really talk about Maya much at all either. He talks about Avidya most of the time. And it's post-Shankara Advaitans like Vedanta Sara and their other, like Madhusudana Saraswati, they talk about all these things. Okay, so first of all, if you want to be rigorous about classical Advaita, and if we're talking about Shankara, then we need to stick to his commentaries, and then we want to talk about Avidya specifically, less so Maya. Okay, but that's more of a kind of a technical quibble. But more fundamentally, what is Shankara's favorite analogy for explaining the relationship between this world of names and forms and the truth of Brahman? Everybody knows it, the rope and the snake, right? The great Rajju Sarpa. Okay, now, based on what you just said, is it plausible to say that the snake is a real manifestation of the rope? Or that it's an illusory appearance of the truth, which is the rope, and that it's a mistake. When I see the rope as a snake, I'm making a mistake. I'm hallucinating something that doesn't actually exist. In exactly the same way, Shankara says, all of these names and forms are hallucinations, superimposed upon the only truth, which is non-dual Brahman. Now, you brought in Sarvapriyanji. Now, the thing is, Sarvapriyanji is a monk of the Ramakrishna Order, and I think when he teaches Shankara, he sprinkles in a bit of Ramakrishna into it as well. And so we end up with a kind of hybrid mixture, some parts Shankara and some parts Ramakrishna. And I prefer to, I try to be rigorous and clear in understanding what Shankara actually said, understanding what Ramakrishna actually said, and then pointing out points of convergence and divergence. And I think that he's trying to build in elements of Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta into Shankara, and I pressed him on this, and we're good friends, and we've been friends for a long time. And I just want to see textual evidence from the commentaries to support the view that names and forms themselves are real manifestations of Shakti, or that Shankara doesn't deny the ultimate truth of the personal God. But I quote evidence from the Brahma Sutra commentary, where he says that the personal God is only true from the standpoint of ignorance. But when we realize the highest truth, all those upadhis vanish, including the upadhis of the personal God. Ishvaratva, omniscience, omnipotence, all those things are only true from the standpoint of ignorance. That's.
Thank you. But just maybe just another remark that Vivek Chudamani, for example, is authored by Shankara.
Maybe
he talks
we don't know
about,
that also. But even let's say that he did. But go ahead. What?
But there this idea of Maya is also discussed. No? Like Vedanta Saram is probably a much later text, but Vivek Chudamani is
right. Yeah. So look, Vivek Chudamani also may not have been composed by him. It could have been composed by a later Shankaracharya. Even if it was by him, the thing is, if you read the Vivek Chudamani as a whole, there are many shlokas which say that there's no difference in ontological status between the waking state and the dream state. And this goes back to Gaudapada's Mandukya Karika, one of Sarvapriyanji's favorite texts. And there's a Karika there which says, Yatha swapne dvayabhasam spandate maya manaha, tatha jagrat dvayabhasam spandate maya manaha. Just as this mind spins out a world in the state of dream, which turns out to be completely bogus, completely fake, unreal. Just so the mind spins out a dream world within the waking state. Now tell me how the world can be a real manifestation of God, if that's the case.
Right. Okay.
Thank you. We should give some others a chance if they have. And then we can come back to you if we have time.
I think we can stop here, and those who want to...
Okay, one more question. How about one more question?
Last question, and then others who want to interact can join us in LHC 313.2.
Okay. Yeah, join us upstairs then. Is it upstairs or where is it?
Upstairs in the same building,
yes.
313.2. We'll take this last question and then we conclude. Professor Soumya Shubranag will deliver the vote of thanks and we conclude the event.
Thank you, Swamiji. My question is, I heard saying in the Vaishnavas, they say, Brahma nahi Maya nahi Jeev nahi Kal, apni ho sudhi na rahi, ek raho Nandalal. Which means I don't want to know about Brahma, I don't want to know about the soul, I don't want to know about the Maya. I just want to lose myself so that in my memory, I only remember Krishna, I just fall in love with Krishna. So how can I reconcile it with the Advait Vedanta? Like what can the person who believes in this also attain that liberation which you talked about?
Oh, You mean the Advaitic realization?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way that Sri Ramakrishna answers the question is by saying that even bhaktas who think only of, let's say, Krishna, for instance, by the grace of God, God can just give that person Advaitic pure consciousness. And there's a shloka in Bhagavata Purana which says basically the same thing. So you don't even have to practice the path of knowledge, but a bhakta can also attain the highest truth. And this is something that Sarvapriyanji also mentions in his Q&A and all that. That's not something Shankara will say, but it's something that Sri Ramakrishna upholds.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. We can continue the conversation upstairs, or that's up to you.
Yeah, upstairs. 313.2.
Yeah, see you guys upstairs.
This brings us to the end of this wonderful event. I want to thank Swami Medhananda for his wonderful talk and his presence here in spite of his busy schedule. He's going to travel back to the US tonight or early in the morning. So we are very thankful to him for his time here. Also, this is one occasion to thank all our volunteers, Anish, Dimple, Vivek, Nitesh, Neha, Swati, Dushwant, Professor M.R. Ravi, Professor Rahul Garg, Professor Sangeeta, and many other people who have helped us in the way. And also to all the people who have joined us in spite of their busy schedule and lab hours and this being working day. So we are very thankful to you for coming up in numbers. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you in the next event by NRCVEE in quick time. Thank you very much, and good evening. Yeah. আচ্ছা, একটা কথা হচ্ছে এই দুটো জিনিস এভিকে দিতে হবে, ওদেরকে দিয়ে দিও।